3% of our resident population. So again, as you're looking at the survey results, just recognize that there is a slight favor to the older segment of the population. Again, this is probably another reason why I think it's really important for you to take a close look at what the younger segment of the population said that they needed. Okay? So we'll go through the survey results. Now I have to admit, when I first saw this response, when I saw this response, I went, that doesn't make sense based on what you're telling me later in the survey. So you may have had a similar reaction when you read it. But the first question is, do you believe the library meets the needs of residents? And overall, there was a 34% disagreement rating saying, no, the library is not meeting the needs of Pinehurst residents. Reminder, if it's over 20% satisfaction, our policy has been that's when we have a red flag, or that's when we take a look at, is there something going on there that we need to look at, okay? So 34% overall disagreement rating, meaning library does not meet the needs of our residents. And then the disagreement rating for residents under the age of 35 was even higher than that, okay? So if you're looking here at this last bottom left chart, you can look at the grand total here. So you can see that the blue and the green is the disagreement rating, okay? So normally, if the disagreement is below 80% on this chart, right, meaning greater than 20%, that would be our indicator. But you can see that this under 35 years old has a much, much higher disagreement rating. And in fact, that disagreement rating was 54%. So, meaning only 46% of those residents felt that the library met the needs of Pinehurst residents, okay? So, you get this, right? So, if 34% disagreed or said that the library didn't meet our needs, then another 64% said it did meet our needs, right? But then when we go to question number 2, and we look at what capabilities need to be expanded, there were a lot of indications that there was a need for expansion. So the two questions to me seemed a little bit in conflict with one another. And I don't know if question number 1 had been later in the survey, if question number 1 and 2 had been flipped, if we would have gotten a different result. I don't know. But there was, I think, a little bit of conflict there. But when you get into the detail of specific library capabilities that our residents said they felt needed to be expanded, what I've done here is I've kind of grouped them for you. So the first is collection. So back in February, we heard a lot of talk about collection and books being very important to our residents. And these survey results really reaffirmed that notion as well. So you can see we asked specifically if adult books or young adult books and children's books and collection overall needed to be expanded. I'm gonna make that a little bit bigger. Is that easier to read?
Much easier, thank you.
I'm sorry. I'll do that for you. So in the top left, you can see adult books and magazines. And again, this is an easy way for me to review this is looking at the blue. So the blue bars are really what residents feel are extremely needed is in the light blue, very needed is in the dark blue, okay? So when I did my analysis, I focused on the blue, okay? Because some things are moderately needed, some are slightly needed, and some residents are indicated were not needed at all. So again, when I did my analysis, I focused on where did the blue bars land, the light and the dark. So when you look at this, if you look at just the blue bars on the screen, you can see that adult books and magazines and children's books and magazines were the ones that were that residents said needed to be expanded a little bit more so than young adult, but not by much. So there was, I think, a clear need expressed in an increased or expanded collection at the library. In addition to that, you'll see the start of a trend throughout the rest of the survey results where this under 35 segment expresses a much higher need than the other age segments. So you can see it here in young adult, and you can also see it here in children's books and magazines. A little bit here in adult magazines, but it's more predominant in the young adult and children's collections. Are there any questions about what the survey is saying as it relates to the collection needs?
One of the other things that came out too was the value of digital media.
Mm-hmm. And that will be on the next slide.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Natalie, clarifying the database, we know we had 411 responses, correct?
410.
Or 10.
Spread over the different age groups, neighborhoods, this sort of thing. What were the total notices sent out? 4,000, 5,000, 2,000? Do we know that? Do you know that?
I do not know that. I'd have to go back and look at the contract, John. I think typically they would have probably, don't quote me on this, I'll have to go back and look, but I want to say they probably spread the band around 800 or so. It would be my guess, but I can't say for sure. The contract just says that they would select a sample and obtain at least 400 responses. So if they had to send it to 2,000 people to get 400 responses, then that's what they did. Just depended. Okay, so that's really kind of where I think what the survey's telling us about adults, young adults, and children's collection. And again, consistent with what we heard in February was a demand for expanded digital media at the library. So that's up here in the upper left-hand corner. And again, focus on where the blue bars land. So there's, here, we've got 53% of respondents saying that the digital media should be expanded. And when you look at extremely needed, I thought this was an interesting result. Extremely needed is the light blue. The 45 to 54-year-old segment really felt very, very strongly about the need for expansion of digital media, with greater than 40% of that group saying it's extremely needed. The other things related to that are the digital learning lab and print and copy and scan services. These are services that we asked about in the original online survey, and the results are indicated here. I believe the library currently has one public computer available for public use, and overall we had again another 38% saying that it was either extremely or very needed to expand the digital learning lab and public computers. Once again, the younger segment of the population indicated a much higher need than the older segment of our population. Same thing with print, copy, and scan services. Again, a 36% said extremely or very needed. Higher demand among the younger residents shown here. The other thing I would point out when you're reviewing these charts and graphs, it's the green bar is where residents are saying it's not needed. Okay, so if you want to quickly look across for green to say we don't need this, you can use that as a tool. So for example, in digital media, it was less than 20% said it did not need to be expanded at some level, okay? So then we move on. We had a lot of questions in here, in question 2, if you recall. Question 2 also asked about programming needs for our residents. And by far, the greatest program need identified was identified to be expanded was the children's programs. And so you can see here, we actually had more than 50% saying that it was needed in really all of these age groups going across the board. So while there was, again, the younger population felt a need for young adult program expansions, but this children's program expansion was the highest level of need expressed in the entire survey. In terms of what other capabilities need to be expanded, we asked about book clubs, lectures, and discussion groups, conference and meeting space, and individual quiet study workspace. This result was a little surprising to me. I did not expect it to be quite as high as it was, especially among the younger segments. But there was a clear need for book clubs, lectures, and discussion groups expressed, I believe, in the survey. A little bit lesser of a need expressed for conference and meeting space. And while individual quiet study workspace was a need identified, it seems to be, again, those younger segments who are looking for a quiet place to go at the library. Any questions so far? No?
Oh. Interrupt your presentation, because I'm sure we all do have questions, but why don't we follow to the end and then try
And
to
keep going? Okay, then we'll go back. Okay,
thoughts in your mind while we're listening.
okay, I'll keep going. Here's where you see a lot of green, right? So a lot of green meaning residents did not feel that this was a high need of theirs. And that is as it relates to art, music, and performance space. So you can see very little blue and a lot of green. So not a lot of need expressed for that purpose. And in terms of quiet relaxation space, again, the under 35 had a greater need for that. However, it was not as great of a need as other spaces that were identified in the survey. Here are where you also see additional lots of green, meaning not needed, maker space and retail co-location. So overall, not a lot of support or need for art, music, and performance space, maker space, or retail co-location. We also asked in question 3, what are the top 3 features most needed in the library? To no surprise, and again, very consistent with what we heard in February through the various public input methods, residents indicated the top needs are really collection, adults and children's primarily. However, there are some demand for young adult books for the under 35 segment. So you'll see the themes here are collection, digital media, and children's programs. There, here, there, and there, okay? We also asked about the extension of library operating hours. And you can see here, the dark blue indicates that residents felt like the hours should be extended. The yellow is that they did not feel or agree that the hours should be extended. So if you're looking at this, what this tells you is that there is some need for extension of weekday evening hours as well as Saturday hours. Not as much need expressed for Sunday hours being extended. Currently, the library is not open on Sundays. However, households with children had a higher need for Sunday operating hours. Then the 5th question we asked is, should the village fund and operate the village's public library? And there was overall support of that at a rate of 67% of total responses said the village should operate the library. 33% disagreed that the village should fund and operate the library. And what I've done here is I've segmented it again by users and non-users, households with and without children. And you can see that both users and our households with children in them felt that the library should be operated by the village at a higher rate than non-users and households without children. And now we get into the fun part. So they told us what they needed. The second big key point or purpose of the survey was to understand what Pinehurst residents would be willing to pay for. And so the first question that we asked as it related to that subject was, how much would you be willing to pay in additional taxes? And I have segmented this by age group as well as users and non-users. Overall, 43% of residents said they would not support a tax increase to fund the public library. 31% indicated they would be willing to pay up to a penny. And as a reminder, a penny generates roughly $397,000, close to $400,000 a year. Another 13% said they'd be willing to support 2 pennies. Another 10% said they would support up to 3 pennies. So just realize that this is cumulative. So this 10% would support either a 1, 2, or 3 cent tax increase. Okay, make sure that's clear. You can see that over here, again, the blue is no increase, that the users of the library are willing to support tax increases at a higher rate than non-users. And as a reminder, users represent about 45% of our population. I would point out too that the residents over 65, as well as a 35 to 44-year-old group, were also less supportive of a tax increase. And again, remember that the survey is a little bit weighted more towards the 65+ age demographic. We also asked how much residents would be willing to contribute to a capital campaign, and I thought this was fairly promising results in terms of our community's willingness to support a capital fundraising campaign. We had fairly good response rate here. We had, right around 20, a little bit over 20% in total said they would give up to $50. Then we had another, 20, 25% here saying I'd give up to 100. And again, users down at the very bottom being much more likely to donate than non-users. We even had some say they would give more than $10,000. So when I look at all that data and I segmented it and I correlated it and I analyzed it, I did at least try to start with summarizing what I believe were some of the key findings. And this is our objective number 1 for today, is to see, do you, council, agree with these key findings, or do you have findings that differ from these? And so if I can, I'll go through these real quick and I'll finish the presentation and then we'll just come back to this slide if that's okay. Overall, again, this is just high-level summary of what I just shared with you. We had a 34% disagreement rating, which is higher than our 20% standard that we try to use as a benchmark or a guide. And we had much higher disagreement ratings from our residents under the age of 35, with 54% of them saying that the library does not meet their current needs. The key needs for expanded programs or capabilities, based on all of that segmented data that we just went through in question number 2 in the survey. So again, what I was looking at here is if approximately 40% of our population said that something was extremely or very needed, it made this list. And so, as I mentioned, it's a book and magazine collection, all ages, digital media, children's programs, digital learning lab, print copy and scan, and book clubs, lectures, and discussion groups. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the greatest need expressed in the entire survey was for an expansion of children's programs. If you go to the right here, there were some additional needs that were expressed. And those were expressed by our younger residents, maybe not overall or in total, but the younger residents indicated needs for adult and young adult programs, conference meeting space, quiet study and workspace, as well as relaxation space. As we go back and reflect on the operating hour question, more than 60% of both users and non-users and households with and without children expressed a need for extended weekday and Saturday operating hours. And based on the results of the question that asked if the village should fund and operate the library, there was, like I said, 67% said that they thought the village should do that. Now, when we look at terms of funding, as I mentioned here, 67% said the village should support and operate, and 76% of users said that, and 78% of households with children said that. So my key takeaway is that I think there is public support for the village operating and funding the library. With that said, they'd like it for free.
Yes.
And they don't want to, and only 43% don't support a tax increase. That was a joke. It is free public library services that we're discussing here, but there was not a lot of support for a tax increase. 57% did say they would support at least a penny. So I think you have some support there. It's just a matter of at what level you might be comfortable with. Again, as I mentioned, the residents that expressed a greater need for expanded library capabilities, that age group of 45 to 54 indicated they would be more willing to pay a tax increase. And then I've summarized the percentages there for you. When I went back and I looked at what did we hear in February, and is this similar to or is this different from what we heard earlier? And in some cases there were similarities, and in other cases there were some differences. So just as a reminder, we did have an extensive public engagement process in February. We had 386 respondents to an online survey. We had 115 residents attend public meetings in this room. We had 4 1.5-hour meetings with 53 residents for those community conversations, and we also conducted 26 personal interviews. I think that the ETC survey and the online survey were similar in some areas. And I do want to point out that the question was worded very differently in the ETC survey. So it's not a one-for-one, yes and yes. They said the same thing. Because the online survey asked if respondents would be likely to use, meaning would I personally use it? Would I personally use a digital learning lab? The ETC survey was asked, do you feel if there is a need for that expansion for the community? Okay, I can read it exactly. Just to be completely clear. It said, indicate which library feature or capability you believe needs to be expanded or enhanced in the library. Not whether you would personally use it, but did you feel that it needed to be expanded or enhanced in our community? Okay. So there was a slight difference, but with that difference, we did notice greater than 30% disagreement ratings in both the online survey and the ETC survey. The key themes that kept coming up, I think that were consistent between that survey and this one, are increased collection size, greater access to digital media, as well as expanded children programs. Those are the key kind of themes that I saw. Households with children and younger residents expressed a greater need for library services than older residents in both surveys. There was consistent support for a digital learning lab of some sort. And there was not a lot of support in either one for art, music, and performance space or maker space.
Natalie, remind me what maker space means?
Maker space is create something. Fred, do you want to describe a maker space? Microphone.
Need to use your microphone, Fred, sorry.
Build robots.
It would include things like laser cutters, 3D printers, art, video, and music editing platforms, things like that, to allow you to create content.
And it can be done in a fairly small space.
Right.
It's not like a giant lab or anything
Right.
like that.
Where you can go make things, make things. On the second page here of this kind of where I tried to see what the similarities or the differences were, there were a couple things that rated a little bit higher in the ETC survey, and that was book clubs, lectures, and discussion groups, as well as the individual quiet study and the print copy scan services. And then those things that rated lower in the ETC survey were meeting space and retail co-location. There was a lot more support for retail co-location initially than there was in the ETC survey. And when I take a look at the other input methods, again, I think the themes were really a larger collection, more digital media, expanded children's programs. We did hear a lot about expansion of service hours during the February public engagement process. And we also heard in February through the various input methods that there wasn't a lot of demand or desire for this maker space, if you will. And that is my summary or my analysis of the library, ETC library survey results. And I'm going to sit down and see if we can talk through these key findings, see what questions you have, and see if maybe you had some additional findings that you'd like to share.
And while you're doing that, Natalie, so these key findings that got points above 40%, that's with taking out the don't knows.
Correct. It was excluding the don't knows.
I'm sorry. Could you repeat that question, Judy?
So,
And maybe into the microphone a little bit there.
I can answer
Or
a little bit.
Natalie, yeah.
Yeah, so we always do this with all of our surveys. If somebody says, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know, they're excluded from the responses. We do that for our community survey, our business survey, and this survey as well. So if you look at if you're looking at the actual document in the back, for example, when ETC, I'll turn you to a page. I can pull it up if you'd like, if it would be helpful. Let me just
yeah, I think that
Okay,
would
thank
be
you.
easier.
So when you look at the actual survey results, the tabular data at the very end, okay, so section 2 of the ETC survey, which starts on page 15, if you look at the tabular data, you can see, do you believe the library meets the needs? And you can see here that 21% said they don't know if it does or doesn't. So what is common in the survey industry practice is to take out the do not knows and analyze those who provided a response.
Agreed.
Yeah, so that was Judy's question. Yes, all the analysis was done on the without do not knows.
Show them that chart. I mean, because you had, what, 16 different factors? And so people said it was extremely needed to not needed, and then there was a group that said don't know. And so when she got the 40% or more, they were constructed out of the don't know.
It was
group.
constructed from this chart on page 18.
And if you kept them in, it's just slightly lower ratings, that's all.
Correct. Does that answer your question, Judy?
Natalie, I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
It's my understanding that folks who were not included in the sample size were able to submit their responses. and those would be kind of kept off to the side. Do you know how many responses we got from residents who were not in the sample size?
I do not know. They did not provide me with that information. So what Lydia's referring to is there was a link to complete the survey, right? And so if you got it in the mail, there was a link. That link could be shared with other people, and other people could have chosen to fill out the survey. If those people chose to fill out the survey and were not included in the randomly selected households, they were able to fill out the survey, but their results, their feedback was pushed to the side and is not included in here. So what is in here is only those households that were randomly selected. And I do not know the answer to that question.
Do you mind just finding out? It might indicate additional interest in the in the survey.
Yeah, I'll be happy to.
Okay, great,
Yeah,
thanks.
I think that's a good point. I think we should see that along with the question I asked earlier about what was the total number in the end of surveys that were
That they
sent out.
distributed, okay?
Right. And there may be a question within that about, and they got to the point of not getting quite to the 400 level, they had to send out additional surveys, right?
They did, but I will tell you that they were very pleased with the response rate. They didn't have to work hard to get responses.
Okay, all right.
I do know that.
And the additional surveys that were sent out after the first batch were, again, divided by age, neighborhood, as well as they could with that additional.
Yeah, they really do strive to get the age breakdown as close to our census demographic data as possible. You know, so I told you that this survey is weighted a little bit more to the 65-plus segment. They do their very best to try to get it as close as possible, but that was as close as they could get.
So to play devil's advocate, and with all the questions I'm sure we all have on our mind, what I'm hearing is there would be a desire, if the village decides to become the operator and the funder of the library, there would be a desire to update the collection of books and magazines pretty much across the board. There'd be an emphasis on digital media, and my thought would be, yes, that's a strong request, not just in the younger population, but in the sort of next tier up, which was a little bit interesting to me when I read this, and you repeated it today. But of course, that interest in digital media is going to flow through those people's lives. So, you know, they're younger today, but they're going to get older, and they're going to be wanting to have that digital capability going forward, and that's something to consider as well. There's a lot of emphasis on the children's programming, more than I might have thought, and maybe more than could be provided if under whoever's managing the library. And the question, though, of how to read the numbers. You talked a lot about the 20% level in our surveys, and if there's a 20% disagreement or factor in any particular question, it's important to look at that. So we need to think about that, not only for those things that seem to want to have the village provide library services and want to have changes in the capabilities and the higher percentages of those, but there's a 20 to 30 to 40% factor against some of those things too. So we need to consider that both sides of the question here. There are disagreements and issues for lots of segments of the population as they look at different aspects of this. And a lot of that came out in the question of, you know, what would you pay? And I would say at the best, there's modest support for even a penny increase in tax increase for supporting a library if the village were to do that. So those are some of my takeaways from reading this and hearing your presentation now. I'm sure there are no other questions of the village council that would like to be added here, so we can just go on, Fred, and you can talk.
Move on to the
Now,
next one.
let's open it up for questioning, and Jane, would you like to start here this morning?
Thank you. Fun with numbers. It is interesting to look at the numbers and see what they say. I went back and looked at the summer resident survey and what that said about the library, and it was question Q12-2, which showed an 88% satisfaction rate with the libraries as it is, up from 70% in 2015, which I thought was interesting. Reasons given for not using the library on that summer survey were, and also only 6% indicated that they were dissatisfied. But reasons given for not using were for problems with services, only 11%, problems with programs, 11%, problems with hours, 8%, and IT problems, 7%. But 20% said the reason for not using it was other, that the library wasn't important to them. 23% gave that as their reason, and didn't know, 23%. So all of these items that are coming out in this survey really weren't a big deal relatively in the summer ETC survey, which I thought was interesting. Looking at who's willing to pay a tax increase, well, 43% said not, they would be willing to pay none. But if you then add in the people who would be willing to pay only a 1 penny tax increase or a 2 penny tax increase, which is not enough to cover the operating costs of a Southern Pines type library, which would take 3 cents, then it's 87% of the population, or the respondents, sorry, are not willing to pay enough in taxes to cover the library. And donating to a capital campaign, 34% they said they wouldn't donate outright. But another 44% are only willing to give up to $100. Well, running a capital campaign, that's not that much. So we're talking about 78% are not willing to really chip in toward a capital campaign. So I saw the breakdown here a little bit differently, and my takeaway is a little bit different. I think there is a strong indication for a wider book collection and for better operating hours or additional operating hours. But I'm not seeing an indication that people want a big building or something like that. I think what they'd like to do is make better use of what we've got. I looked also at the open-ended questions at the end, and this isn't scientific. I went and put hash marks, and I divided up into do nothing, make the best of what we've got, or start over with a new big library. And I got 29 hash marks for a new library, 64 hash marks for making better use of what we've got, and 106 for do nothing. So, you know, the numbers, there's a lot of different ways to look at numbers, but those are some of the things that I noticed.
Can I comment on I think Jane's made a very important observation here in comparing and trying to interpret these numbers in relation to the annual resident survey that we do. And I think it's a critical point to make. Every survey that we send out has a wide variety of folks that for whatever reason don't turn in their survey. And I think it's, on a simplistic level, it's kind of easy to say that. They weren't sufficiently motivated to fill out the survey, whether it's because they had strong feelings one way or the other. In our annual resident survey, there are lots of things that capture the interest of our potential respondents, reasons that they will be motivated to provide feedback. One of those many reasons is the library. On this survey, it was all about the library, and so we only captured input that was coming from people that were sufficiently motivated to give us input on the library. And so, in trying to reconcile what our annual resident survey says versus this, I would suggest that we should always ground ourselves in what the resident survey says in terms of resident satisfaction with library services, because I think you're getting a more representative sample from across the village population. And I think it's the same factor is important as we look at the results from this survey and how to interpret the different feedback that we got from the younger demographic. Natalie suggested that, we only had 16% of respondents in this survey come from that key younger demographic, and that was underrepresentative of what that demographic component is in our overall population. But go back and think about, we send out the surveys, ETC does their best to ensure that they distribute the surveys in a representative way, and for whatever reason, that younger demographic was less motivated to respond. Another way to say that is that more of them were indifferent to the question of library services for whatever reason. Maybe they're just more busy. But the point is, a lot of indifference is not factored into these results in this survey for that younger demographic. And that's another way to look at it. In other words, if we got a more representative sample of feedback from that demographic, it might be slightly more positive than the results show here.
Imagine if we sent out a separate survey on stormwater.
That's right. You'll get different feedback, because some people are really, really motivated about that issue.
Yeah. The intensity level will be
Yeah.
up, I think.
Yeah.
Good point.
Natalie, any comments on that? Or
We can do this a couple ways, maybe, if the other council members want to, kind of share some general thoughts. After hearing your comments and Jane's comments, I'm looking for consensus, right? As we go. And I heard, Jane, you mentioned collection and hours. That's what I think I heard primarily as you agreeing that there was a need for expanded collection and expanded hours. Is that correct? Did I get that right?
I would use the word updated collection.
Updated?
Which probably infers expansion as well, but that's kind of what.
More than 17,000 books.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Well, we need more, but we need newer or whatever on that. Lydia, Kevin, you want to speak? Kevin first, Lydia, go ahead.
I was telling Jeff this morning, it hit me. How do you eat an elephant?
One bite at a time.
One bite at a time. And I guess my sense is that we started laying groundwork with a library working group. And I come to this brand new, and I've gone through their materials. You go through what happened with community conversations, that survey. Then we got the ETC survey. And now I think it's time for council to start taking the bites out of the elephant. And Natalie, appreciate something you said in a memo over the weekend. We make fact-based decisions. So I think council needs more facts. And, went through the findings, and, I've come up with my list of just additional facts that we need as we start taking bites out of this elephant. And I'll just say, for example, adult books and magazine collection, what does that mean in terms of the resources it's going to take, the size it's going to take, what is it going to take to provide that service. And as I go through each of these, we need more facts to determine how those services are to be provided. And then, in addition to that, are they provided here, or do we collaborate with other libraries? And I know we talked generally with other libraries as we were back, when the work was done earlier. But we now know with some confidence what the public wants in library services. And I don't know who has that conversation with Moore County, with Aberdeen, with Sandhills, with Southern Pines, but I think to me, there's no need to have 5 identical libraries in this part of Moore County. So how do we collaborate with them to maybe jointly provide some of these services? The capital campaign, I have a lot of questions about how that works. Speaking of elephants, the elephant in the room is the archives. How do we work through that? With whom do we talk? Do we talk to USGA? Do we talk to the resort? Do we talk to, I know there are residents in the community who are very passionate about the archives. Do we bring them into the discussion? Audrey, do we have an inventory of what's in the archives? And, we know the USGA wants to do a museum. We have the archives. Do those collections work together? Is there overlap? But that's a whole, that's the elephant that needs to be discussed. So I mean, I don't have any problems with your findings.
Okay.
And I read the comments too, but it was interesting how many, not that many, but there were respondents that were not happy with the children in the community, but do we have any reason to believe that the children aren't here to stay? I mean, and children are reality. We're a great place to raise kids. So that tells me that we need to look to the future. If we do something, and that's another great point, we have to start taking bites out of this elephant methodically and come to a conclusion about which services we're going to provide, how we're going to provide it, how we're going to pay for it. But it's premature in my mind to start making those decisions now until we have more facts, which you had mentioned.
Totally agree. I totally agree. I think there's a lot of additional information that you need, and we're not going to get through that today. And I appreciate your comment.
Well, there were some comments too in the open-ended, like, make a decision, would you? This has been going on, and I think we all have seen criticism that we just can't reach a decision. It's time to reach a decision. It's not going to happen overnight, but I don't see any reason why we can't make a decision. 5 of us with staff's input.
Yeah, I mean, I look at the additional information that I think you need. I mean, cost is one large piece of information that you don't have right now, because we have, we still have to have the discussion about what amount of square footage is needed to meet this need, right? So first of all, if we can agree on what the need is, then we can move to the next step, then we can move to the next step and the next step. And there will be additional information that's needed along points. There's legal restrictions. There's all kinds of
parking restrictions.
There's all kinds of other stuff. I'm confident that that information can be obtained in, fairly short order. I don't think you're too far away. But there definitely is some additional information that you need. And again, today, if we can agree on the findings, I think, that will tell us where we need to go kind of next.
Well, and it seems as though, I mean, as we start getting more facts, we can set the facts we're comfortable with aside, but that may indicate more facts
Correct.
as we work our way into making this fact-based decision.
Absolutely. Yep. All right.
Let
So
me-
I heard you say you didn't have any disagreement with the key findings that are in here. Okay? Next.
Kevin, I think you want to speak?
Yeah. Kevin.
Yeah, this is kind of what I thought we were going to get that we didn't get. So these are facts. I don't argue with facts. So you extracted some facts, and facts are a great basis to build a strategy. And I think when you combine these facts with that understanding the limitations that Jeff said with the community survey, I think we can bracket kind of where we need to be. We can bracket this, and now we're building something on facts instead of opinion, conjecture, want, which was what happened prior. It was a really big misstep, and this looked like a perfect first step. So this is great.
Thank you, Kevin.
But I just want to be on record that I think it should be publicly funded and immediately. Like I wish we could take over the public operations of the present library today. If we existed as a municipality in 1980, I mean in 1970 when this 69 when this that would have been our library to manage, but we didn't exist till 1980. So the problem is our municipality began in 1980, and that's why we have a private funded library. We would never have a privately funded library if that library is formed. If that library wasn't there, we would have formed one. Maybe on that site, because that's our village green. So that question to me is answered, okay? I want it to be publicly funded, but I also want to listen to what Jane says about restraint and need but to follow what Lydia said, do something. We should take over, figure out how to take over operations immediately. We could still do whatever we need to do as long as we take over operations immediately. So I'm for funding operations. I'm one person, I'm not, but as a council member 2.5 years ago, I wanted to do that 2.5 years ago. I wanted to do that a year ago. I want to do it 2 years ago. I want to do it today, and I want that clear. The rest of the stuff we're going to extract with facts, and we finally have a basis for facts, and I'm very appreciative.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a couple of points. One, I love seeing the value of digital media because there's no brick and mortar cost with that. So that as we get into sizing and understanding, how a library would function, it's great that that's a dominant resource that people need because it doesn't take up any square footage to do that. And it definitely is the way of the future.
We can do that today.
In every respect. And I think I agree with Lydia that we have to look to the future for this decision. We can't, whatever yesterday was, it was. And it's really today moving forward. And Kevin, I don't know if we ought to take over operations of the library immediately, but that's a provocative thought and something we can certainly put on the table as well. But I think as an analog for what the sentiment of the community is, I look back to the 2018 school bond. And I actually had, in February, when a lot of people were swirling about, the concerns about what the sentiment was coming out of the surveys, I asked Linda to give me a cut of that vote by Pinehurst. And if you all recall, the overwhelming majority of the community voted for that, something like 79.4%. But in Pinehurst, each and every precinct outdrew that. Our highest precinct was the Pinecrest High School, which is number 7, CCNC, lawn and tennis, Morganton. 87% of that group voted for that. The lowest was 81.14%, which was Pinehurst Trace and 6, that Pinehurst B1. I was blown away that, we were much higher in sentiment to support the school bond than the whole county. So I think that that's a really good analog for us to have as a frame of reference here as to whether or not this becomes a publicly funded resource, and have confidence, really, that that's what the community also wants you to do and their expectations. And I agree, there were lots of things in here where people didn't want to do it, but I think at some point we have to decide what are the municipal services that we want to provide. And you're right, Kevin, if we had been an existing entity when it came time to have a library, it probably would have been a municipal library. But time, makes a difference. And I think that there is a rationale for what our library can provide. In terms of the key needs for expanded programs or capabilities, I really sort of draw the line a little bit shorter than yours. I think you have space for people to, some community space, but we don't really need to have an enormous amount of space. But the collection is obviously insufficient, and digital media is definitely a resource around that. But I think that, you've laid out some good things here that most of us would agree with.
Okay, thank you, Judy.
Natalie, sort of on this question of do we agree on the results, right? That's where we are. I have no reason to doubt the veracity of the results, all right? My question will be, and other council members perhaps too, is can whomever is going to provide library services, whether it's the village or something else, can they actually provide all those things? And my view is that I'm not sure we could. Just thinking from a council point of view at this point, I'm not sure we could, at least initially. If we did move forward, I have no reason, again, to disagree with the results as they're presented, but I'm not sure we would be able to provide all those things, at least in the near term. So
And I think that is an excellent point that you make, John, is that what I tried to do here is really identify for you what I thought I was hearing and seeing throughout the entire process, but specifically right here, what this survey said in terms of where the most need was expressed. And to Judy's point, the bare minimum line is under children's programs, in my opinion, based on the analysis. So, there was a need expressed for some of these other things, and that's why we have Fred to tell us, can you meet that need in one room that's, 300 square feet? And is that worth it or is it not worth it? That's why we've got him on the team. And so there will be some prioritization. Like maybe we don't meet that need today, but maybe we can meet that need in 5 or 10 or 15, or maybe we meet a part of the need, but not all of the need. So I think those are kind of the things that, that you're going to have to wrestle with based on, the evaluation factors that you really
So is there
settle
a
on.
consensus then of the council on do we agree with the results? Is there consensus that yes we do, no we don't? And I see Jeff's going to have a question here or something to point out. Kevin?
I said I agreed with the combination of results, which might be a little different
Combination.
of the community survey
Yeah.
and this. That's what I said, and also agreed with the comments. I'm hoping you're going to take these comments, because I would have had more comments. Lydia took some of mine. John had some of mine. The 20 percentile question, 20 percentile for, the 20 percentile against. How is that going to be dealt with? And Jane's questions and Judy. So yes, I agree with I don't argue with data.
Okay, thank you.
Jeff, did you have something that you wanted to add on that, I think?
You know, I took interest in Natalie's comment that she would put the highest priority on children's program. I guess I'd have to go back and look at the results again. To me, what jumped out was the collection
Mm-hmm.
and various aspects of the collection, because it was common across all age groups. I mean, it was, so,
Yeah, what I was saying was I think it's collection, media, and programs. Like, I think those
oh,
three.
you would draw the line
I would
there.
draw
got
the
it.
line
I got
under
it.
Yes,
children.
and she's in
Yeah.
that column on the left versus the column
Yeah.
on the right.
Clarification.
I'm glad you asked for
Yeah,
clarification.
so everything
Jeff.
above it.
Yeah, because
right.
it's definitely consistent. Collection, digital, so key core need, based on what I'm seeing, is collection, digital media, and children's programs.
And
And the other things, those needs could be, some of those needs could be met relatively easily, in a very small amount of space. Some of them maybe not so, but until we, engage with Fred to talk about, what that might mean in terms of space and requirements, we don't know yet. So we've done some preliminary work on that, but that's really kind of for another day. So I think what I'm hearing.
I agreed with caveat, and you were going to ask everyone else. You stopped with me.
I'm right.
well, Natalie, let me add one thing to drawing the line. I agree that those top three belong in the top three. Can we draw a dotted line or agree until we really get further into this, and just keep an open mind as to.
You're definitely gonna, the line can be moved by you.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm saying,
Yes.
we've received this data. We have no reason to doubt the data. The question will be, what can we do with the data
Right.
in terms of what services might be provided if we choose to do that at all?
Right.
And there will be a line drawn in certain places on that. Jane, was there anything else on that? Otherwise, I'd like to move on to the next point, number 2. But did you have a further comment on this aspect of the discussion? I thought I saw you.
Well, no, I think I said it before. I think that the collections and maybe expanded hours are it. And I don't think that the village needs to be setting up, a babysitting service or anything.
Right.
I really don't.
Understood. All right, so.
So I do have one more comment. Natalie, to me, the column on the left and the column on the right, so the one that says key needs, and then additional key needs. So the key
The
needs
addition,
on
the
the
additional
left.
key needs on the right
Which question are you dealing with, Judy? Which
are
box?
those of a younger segment. So basically what's on the left is if overall 40% of respondents said it was extremely or very needed. The ones that are on the right are in addition to, and those are higher needs expressed by younger residents. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so let me just play it back to you, and we'll see if I got it. So key findings, library needs on the left is the aggregate of all the responses.
Correct.
Key findings, library needs on the right are the young folks.
In the top, in the very first box.
In the
yes.
first box
In the
only.
first box only.
Okay, by younger residents,
Yeah.
okay. All right.
First box only
Okay.
is the younger population.
Okay, got it.
So as we're looking to the future and, meeting the needs of younger residents, in anticipation that that segment is probably expanding. So, maybe you don't have conference space now, right? But maybe you have a building that can be expanded to add conference space. Or maybe you have one conference room that seats 6 people, and in 10 years from now, you add another one,
Maybe we already have a conference space.
or
at the
maybe you
community
already
center.
have a conference space, right? So that's the kind of, I think, approach that you might, want to consider taking as we get down the road.
And one other thing is we begin to look at how these things
How,
might occur.
correct.
There certainly was a lot of sentiment that, the community center could be a factor here in terms of its space and things like that. And that's just something we need to look at, whether that's realistic or not. And certainly they took us to task for, not thinking about the library when we thought about the community center. So, but I think definitely we've got to think about, we're doing this for the future. probably more than 10 years out, more like a 20-year out kind of time frame.
All right, let's move on. Do you want to
Yeah,
get
think
into
we're good.
point number 2? And
So I'm hearing general
Fred.
consensus that,
That was the question.
Well, wait a second. The large amount of support for the village to fund and operate the library?
yeah, 60.
I take issue with that, because I looked at the number of people who were willing to pay enough money in taxes to support a Southern Pines type library, and it's only 13%.
Okay,
I
I
think,
was referring
yeah,
to
I think there-
question
I think
number
we need to add
5.
a caveat to that comment. There was a question, I mean, one of the questions actually
Question 5.
does
yeah.
drive that result, but then when you actually ask folks what they are,
Willing to
they
spend.
personally are willing to pay, it leads to a different conclusion, I
That's
think.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Jane, that key finding was really referring to this chart right here, where 67% of residents or respondents said that the village should fund and operate it.
Which I found,
I was referring to this
Amazing.
question right here, question 5.
But then you have to ask, what do you mean fund and operate? So,
Correct, which is this, so in terms of key findings, I put all the funding and operating key findings on the next page.
Yeah, I think the point, though, is that we just need to be objective about
Objective,
the
right.
findings we're drawing from this thing. And we have two sets of data in this survey that might lead folks to think about this in two very different ways, and I think we need to recognize them both.
but at the end of the day, you know, people are not going to jump up and down for a property tax increase, and there also may be other ways to do it, like a flat fee that somebody in here suggested, a library tax. It's just, you know, used in other communities as well. But I think there was, you know, very enthusiastic support, more than I really expected, for a public library.
And adding to what Judy just said, and on my list of things to do is look at funding options, but I'm going to,
It is on the list later.
okay.
Yes,
I
I think we
reconcile.
do have to, there's a lot to do in terms of identifying
I
funding
reconciled what
sources.
Jane said by saying combining the community survey and this together. That's how I was able to reconcile it with the same data that you're presenting. Does that make sense? You know, I'm saying by including both
what?
data sources. I agree with both data sources, the community survey and this. That's what I said.
And what was the second one?
This one. The
Library.
annual community
And
survey
community
versus.
survey
right.
and
Okay.
this, and I thought maybe that would reconcile it for you, like it did for me, because that's where you're quoting a lot from the community survey. So I'm agreeing with both data sources. That's how I reconcile it. I was trying to say, is that not what you're saying? You're putting weight on the community survey as well as this? No? Oh, okay.
Okay,
Thought it was helpful, but I guess not.
okay,
Okay.
to make one other thing perfectly clear, at least from one person's perspective, that's mine. By agreeing to your point number 1, the objectives here today, the results and the veracity of that, I'm not necessarily saying that I've agreed to pursue the support and the funding of a public library. And understood?
Absolutely.
All right.
Understood.
Step in the direction of the evaluation of that. But by going to that step, it doesn't necessarily mean
Right.
that a decision of the village council will absolutely be to fund and take over the operations of the library. Let's go to
Correct.
point 2.
You don't have enough information to make that decision, in my opinion, right now. Okay, great. Thank you.
Want to hear from Fred here too today, I think.
Yes, we're going to let Fred jump in. So the other two things we really wanted to cover, and the reason that Fred is here, is to really talk about how these surveys might impact what the initial recommendation was, as well as really trying to understand from council what your expectations are of Fred and Library IQ for their final report to you. So your contract right now with them says that that after the ETC survey is prepared, that they would do a written needs assessment report summarizing existing conditions, all the input, research and analysis, the alternative solutions, and a final recommendation. So the question is, do you continue to want Library IQ and Fred to work with us through evaluating solutions and developing a final recommendation, or is your expectation something other than what's in the contract?
My expectation was we come up with a final solution, that they come up with options. So that not what everyone else's is?
I agree with that.
I have a question. I looked at the contract, and it said they would identify and evaluate alternative strategies, such as collaborating with other government-operated libraries locally, expanding existing services, combining library services with Parks and Recs, relocate current library to existing. Have they done all that, or are they still to do that?
So they presented a preliminary library services needs assessment, and then that did evaluate alternative solutions. They did consider these other alternatives, but I think what I heard the council say last time is that maybe some of those alternative solutions need to be explored further and maybe more appropriately by us as opposed to them.
And that goes,
Right.
and my point, number one was collaborating with other government-operated libraries. Moore County wouldn't return their phone calls, so that died. We found out Aberdeen is building a library. I don't know if we can collaborate with them. So to me, that wasn't further explored. The expanding existing, relocate to an existing facility, that seems to me that wasn't appropriately or properly or correctly explored because of the two places that were mentioned and one's not available. So my question was, if this part of the contract hasn't been fulfilled, are there, and I'm just asking the question, should that still be fulfilled by them, by staff? I don't know.
Right, so, and that's what I want to try to get clarification from you in terms of what your expectation is, because the last thing we want to do is bring to you their final report and it not be what you're expecting. So like I said, I think there's additional information that needs to be obtained. I think there's additional analysis that needs to be done. Some of that analysis and information, we will need to rely upon experts to help us. You know, and it could be that council wants, you know, more detail or more information in certain areas that, you know, may go a little bit further than what was originally contemplated. You know, because I do believe that Fred has looked at alternatives and granted the existing building was not thoroughly pursued as a viable alternative initially, but we've had multiple discussions about that option since that report was delivered. So I think there is some, there's definitely value and benefit to having the expert help us understand and translate, and that's really why you're here, Fred, translate this into what does that mean in terms of square footage, right? Because I'm not architect. I can't do that. But what I think I have observed, let me just say this, when the first report was delivered, is that I think what I'm sensing is council's not looking for the architect or anyone else to come in and say, this is your best choice. I think what I've heard you say is, let's help us figure out what our options are and maybe what are some factors that we need to consider, maybe identify a range of best potential options and then the council and us independently do our evaluation, consult as needed if we need detailed cost estimates, 6 months from now or whenever. That's what I think I'm hearing, but I need confirmation.
I agree with that. Is
Okay.
there any difference of opinion on that?
You know, we have totally different data now. We have
Right.
data with a much reduced footprint because we have data instead of opinion. And the previous one eliminated options instead of gave us options. I don't know who in the world pays somebody to eliminate options, but that's what occurred in the previous one. There was options that were eliminated. And it seems like there's only 3 logical options. Be on site with both products, bifurcate with the library on the site, and move the archives. And the third option is the archives on site, and move the library. There's only 3 options. Having this researching buildings we don't own seems like a waste of time. It just seems like an absolute waste of time.
Okay. That's great direction for us.
But that's just me. I just didn't understand
You're looking
it.
for options, and here's what my recommendation is, and as I outlined it in the memo to you. Actually, can I pull that up real quick? Might be helpful. So I'm starting to hear, I think, that my estimation or understanding of what your expectations are for the final report is maybe a range of options, not one single final recommendation. And I think that we've got here, I've listed out kind of next steps, right? So when the next step really is for us to start talking about, Kevin, what are those options, right? And I mentioned this to you maybe in an email, is to think of it kind of like we do birdies. So when we do a birdie evaluation, the birdie team, and for those of you who don't know what that is, that's how we evaluate a process for improvement around here. We will, as a birdie team, identify a laundry list of potential options, okay? So there might be 10 options on the table, and then we narrow it down and say, okay, we're only going to evaluate maybe these 4 options because they are the best 4 options, or they seem to be the most viable of the 4 options. Then we'll weigh each one independently against a set of factors or a set of criteria to figure out which option is the best option that we would bring to you as a recommendation. So, Kevin's got 3, somebody else might have 2, you might have another option that he doesn't have. I think your next step might be to just lay all those out on the table, and in terms of potential location and size, and then figure out how you're going to evaluate each one of those alternative choices. So I think I have clarity. You do not want a final recommendation. And I think that what we'll do is we will have them finalize their report based on the findings after you've identified independently what you think those viable options are.
As long, I
I
mean,
know how to-
I think it's, when we lay out these options, I definitely want Fred's input on,
Right.
The
Right.
sizing and the future fit of it. Is this good for 5 years or 20 or somewhere in
Right.
between?
Is this a building that, or a location that could be expanded in the future if you wanted to, or?
And how might you do it?
Right.
And then the cost estimates, either to refurbish or, comply with ADA or a new construction or whatever
Right.
those options are.
Okay.
Hey, Natalie
Yes, ma'am.
and council.
Timing.
I really like going back to a contract to see what it was we contracted for. And as you mentioned, one of the requirements, one of the things that was to be in the final report was alternative solutions evaluated. So that's something we've already contracted to get. And some of the things that I've put, and Judy just mentioned ADA and future needs, and Natalie, I'll give this to you, but I've got facility use, space use, programs and services, size needs, staffing requirements, IT and furnishings recommendations, capital cost, and operating cost. But I'm going to let you have
Okay.
all of this.
Yeah, and a lot of those specifics were in the preliminary, but they were based on a certain square footage, which, based on some preliminary analysis we've done, we believe is much lower than what was in the original recommendation.
So what can Fred tell us today? What do we want to hear from him today? I'm happy to get a framework within to work. Is that all right?
Okay, yeah, absolutely.
Right.
You want to talk through, Fred, how you would take us from here to there?
Sure, if I can maybe back up for a minute to revisit the preliminary report that you saw. So the preliminary report that you saw was based on the survey and the public input information to date prior to the ETC survey, and based on those needs and wants expressed by the community looking at a 20-year horizon. And the results of that were a 14,000 to 20,000 square foot library facility. Is everybody with me so far?
Yep, that's what
Okay.
it said.
So based on what we're hearing today, if we start removing some of those program elements and focus really just on the collection with digital media, obviously the associated circulation, support spaces, bathrooms, I'm hearing children's program may be in, maybe not in. Where we draw the line is a question. But if we include the children's program and maybe one flex space, we were landing maybe in the 10,000, 12,000, 14,000 square foot range. So if we cut those down, you're maybe at 10 with some of that. So I think the library, it's fair to say we're going from 14 to 20 down to 10 to 12, maybe 14 depending on where you want to be on that line. So the square footage comes down quite a bit, and it does open up some other possibilities, as you've alluded to, with other existing facilities in town. So the other moving piece for us, I think there are two real moving pieces related to the existing building, which now a couple folks have brought up. One is with the archives. So I think that's a very important question for all of you to have with the appropriate parties. What is the goal with the archives moving forward? Is it part of that building? Is it not part of that building? Because that will help inform that decision as well. And then the second piece of that, which I believe you've issued a policy position on how the council views the national landmark status. That was one big question earlier, was whether we needed to ensure that we would maintain landmark status or whether there was flexibility in that. And by saying that, I don't mean to suggest the goal is ever to lose landmark status. But I'm hearing an enhanced level of flexibility that would pertain to potential future expansion of that building. Is that an accurate summary?
It's accurate.
Mm-hmm.
Within historic guidelines, yeah.
Right. Obviously, you have the local historic guidelines as well. So with those two moves, I think those are some of the key questions relative to the existing building and whether it's a good candidate to remain as the library or not looking ahead. Judy, you brought up the other point, the third point which I'd offer, which is when you look ahead, I think it's been identified today that there's kind of a skew in the ETC survey results that seniors appear to be roughly 10% overrepresented and younger folks appear to be roughly 10% underrepresented. So depending on what your expected demographic trends are moving ahead, that would help to inform some of your program choices that you plan for looking ahead, as well as your facility size. So I think our goal would be to establish some ground rules for how you want to approach that moving forward. Because I think the segmentation was very helpful. We're all at different points in our life and we all have different needs and priorities, right? So understanding how we would want to weight some of the library decisions with where you expect your population to go would help inform that as well.
We have those numbers to give you, our estimates.
We do.
So
Yeah, and we've provided them, they have them.
We do. So, but I think consciously rolling that information into what we report would be a critical piece to that.
Agreed, data. I love data.
See that. So as you look ahead, I think a couple of the preliminary options drop off, and I think we add a couple of additional options beyond what you saw, mostly focused around the existing building. But if you're able to work on the archives question a little bit, we can look at it both ways, but obviously with the square footages I gave you, fitting both within that building today would be a challenge. If the archives were to shift or the library were to shift to one or the other, it's definitely more manageable square footage that we're working with.
Well, it's ironic, at the request of the library, they didn't want the archives in the discussion. So it's really not in this document much. And it was a mistake. It was a huge mistake to not look at it holistically. We didn't look at it holistically. So.
Does that help as an overarching summary, I think, of the decision points and the pieces that we would now want to fold back in as we revise and finalize a report for all of you to consider?
I think that's helpful. Jane, you have a question?
Yeah, I'd like to see, as Lydia pointed out, some other kinds of options, such as collaborating with other towns or the county, or even to a certain extent doing so that some of the services we need to provide might be done in collaboration with others, and we don't have to do them all ourselves. Using space in our community center for some of these services, rather than building new. You know, all those kinds of things I'd like to investigate as well.
So can I get some clarity on that, just from a logistics standpoint, in terms of their responsibility versus ours? Because I do believe that Debbie made a very repeated effort to try to engage the county, and the county did not engage on the subject of collaboration. And so the question is that then our responsibility? And do we want to assume that responsibility and determine whether or not collaboration is an option prior to the issuance of their report? Or are you looking for their report to simply reference that collaboration and use in a more prevalent format, that the collaboration and the use of the community center is clearly an option that the council might want to pursue further? Is that fair to say it that way, Jane?
I'd like to take a good look at collaboration.
Okay.
Starting with the definition. What does that mean? And is it any more than we already have?
Okay.
I'll call the county. I mean, I think they'll return my calls. I don't know why they didn't return Debbie's, but I think they'll return mine.
Yeah, I'm very confident that we can open up some discussion with the county, and I think we all want to do that. It gets back to Lydia's comments
happy
earlier,
to
Jane's
do that.
I
comments
just
now.
wanted to confirm
But
that we
that's
wanted
on
to do,
ourselves.
it's
That's
on
on
us,
village
not on
government,
them.
the staff to
Correct.
do that. Yeah, sure.
Correct. Just
Yeah.
wanted to clarify.
Correct.
Okay, good.
Correct.
All right.
Now we have the other questions of Fred. Judy, did you have other questions for Fred?
Do
Lydia?
not? Thank you, Fred.
Could I ask one other brief question just for confirmation as well? So planning for the future, is the 20-year timeframe still an appropriate timeframe to plan for, in your view?
Sorry, repeat that. Planning for the future.
As we look at planning this facility for the future to accommodate future needs, is a 20-year timeframe
20-year.
still an appropriate?
That what we're using our
That
normal
standard,
planning?
Jeff?
What does the village manager think about that?
What, is that standard, Jeff?
It is.
It's hard to
It
do,
is
but 20 years
standard.
seems about right. I don't know, but
Well,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a start point. I mean, I think what you're going to see ultimately is a series of recommendations that would reflect that horizon. And then beyond that, as we grapple with how to resource what we want to do, potentially with this project, we might move that line one way or the other, just because we just don't have the expression, for example, of community support in increasing taxes to do what we thought we might want to have in order to accommodate that 20-year horizon. But I think it will be important to see that information and put it in context.
yeah, Jeff, I agree with that. I think that in looking at options, there might be an option, a short-term option,
That's exactly where I was going.
And then
with
a
the question.
longer-term option
An opportunity for expansion,
in
or,
the future
Yeah.
that's different. Because we've got a lot on our plates right now, if you look at the entire constellation of wonderfulness.
On our plates as a village council and village staff dealing with a number of key issues that are the utmost importance to all the residents of the village of Pinehurst all at the same time. So-
Exactly.
But this is a part of that, yeah.
But I think that timeline, dividing options up that way, is another important way to look at it.
It helps us
Effective.
drive making sure that we don't offer any options that back you into a corner, that they don't really allow expansion possibility or longer-term use. That helps. Thank you.
May I back up just
Well,
one?
That's
oh,
not quite it.
Okay, did you,
I'm sorry, that's not quite what I mean. There might be a short-term option, a placeholder. That's what we do now. And we could consider something different later. I don't mean we
Okay.
look for something that we can start with a brand-new small building and then make it even bigger later. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about having some kind of an interim placeholder,
Okay,
possibly.
thank you.
Possibly.
Lydia?
Now, back to the collaboration issue. I know, in the initial work that was done, it seems to me the question just to these other libraries are you willing to collaborate? But collaborate on what? Now we know. Now we know what our residents are saying that they want, which seems that would make the discussion with those other libraries more meaningful and provide possibly better input
Yeah.
for us.
That's a very good point, Lydia.
I mean, one thing we have to be mindful of is that the Given Memorial Library is not a village asset.
That is a true statement.
Say it again, I couldn't hear you with them.
The Given Memorial Library is not a village asset. We do not own it.
It's an asset, but not one we own.
Right, exactly. Not an asset that we own.
We have a document that says it's a public library. So, we have an agreement that it's the public library.
Speak up, Kevin.
We have a document in place with them that it's the public library. We have a mutually agreed upon document that it's the public library.
I think you're saying, Judy, we don't own the real estate.
Yeah, the real estate is not
Yeah,
ours.
I
So
think
we
she's
have
saying
a
we don't own the real estate.
signed document that it's a public library.
Judy, you just said something that brought to mind a comment that I'd heard before, and it might have been in the earlier comments, maybe when we were talking to stakeholders. But I believe there's material out there that talks about the value of having a public library, the value that provides to an entire community in terms of property values, and
Yes.
that might be important information for us to have.
Okay.
But are you a resource for that sort of information, actually?
I am to some extent, but Debbie is,
Debbie has it.
is a much deeper resource.
Not completely in your wheelhouse, or whatever the phrase is. Judy? Did you?
I want to congratulate council. It's 11:47 and we accomplished all of my objectives for today.
Pat yourself on the back.
What's the timing of our next steps?
So I say that and then I go back to this list of next steps. Does council agree that this is, at least right now, a good way forward for us? What's in the memo?
You're talking about your point 3 again in the memo, right?
Yeah.
4, really.
Yeah, so I would say, my suggestion is we go to step 4. We next start talking about what are those options, identifying, making a good solid list of what other information you need. I have taken notes today. So Lydia, you brought up a couple of things. Jane, you did as well. There was some information that I've already started that running list, if you will. Figure out what other information you need. Talk about what the decision factors are that you're going to use. And then once you have those factors identified, figuring out what how you'll go about evaluating each of those different solutions. But in terms of timeline, that is up to you.
Well, we're on the cusp of a strategic operating
are.
plan cycle. And this seems like an important ingredient to think about what it is we intend to accomplish.
It is. It is. In terms of strategic planning and timeline, I'll offer this. I think December 10th and 11th, I think, Jeff, does that sound right? The days that we've kind of settled on
Yes.
the 2-day council retreat. In the past, we have continued council retreats to early January if we needed to, if there was additional information that we needed to cover. So you certainly have that option. In terms of overall timeline, we try to get your areas of focus identified and our initiative action plans identified by the end of January of each year. With that said, if you're not far enough along in the evaluation process, there's still time to get things in the plan, and because our budget document, our budget requests, in order to pull the budget together, our budget requests are due at the end of February. So while it would definitely be helpful by no later than mid-January to have some clarity as to funding that we would need to include, that would be a perfect scenario, okay? It may not happen. You may not get there by then. So it may be a situation where we display some agility and we modify or amend our strategic operating plan after you've developed it or approved it.
Or you create a set-aside.
Or we create a set-aside, a placeholder, or, you have options there. So I would suggest you not rush through it to meet the strategic planning timeline, I guess is how I would respond to that.
But by mid-January, we should have more tangible data.
It's less critical if you don't see spending money on it next year. In other words, if it's in a 5-year plan, we can continue to massage that going forward. It's very easy. As long as we get that placeholder in there, we get in our planning processes, we can easily grapple with that and display that agility. Right. But if it's something you might contemplate spending significant funds on in next year's budget, then the timeline, or our planning process timeline matters more.
Right, it does.
What is that timeline?
The one I just outlined. So in
January.
December, we'll do the retreat. For example, our plan is to talk about our fund balance policy with you at the retreat. I think that's a key piece of this puzzle that you need to discuss. And so, when I look forward to saying, how do we fund meeting library needs for our community? At whatever level or size or stopgap or short-term or whatever that is, there are options other than property taxes. And so, I think we need to identify those and figure those out. I think, there is a capital campaign fundraising option. We're not experts in capital campaign fundraising efforts, so you may choose to engage a firm to manage such a campaign. So those are the kinds of things and discussions that I think we're going to be having over the course of the next several months as we're in strategic planning, and some of those decisions may affect the timing of when certain things get funded or not funded.
How we manage our capital? Like, do we have instead of just having it in the fund balance, do we move capital into a project-based?
Correct.
Which would make it, which I think is something that's viable to talk about between now and December.
Yeah,
I think you heard me.
Yeah.
I've been wanting the village to take over operations 2.5 years ago, 2 years ago, this year. So there's an inevitability. And also the public doesn't understand our high fund balance. They don't understand how much expenses are out there for us. And they'd probably like to see it capitalized where it's going to be spent. So that's something that could be done. You're still not spending it, but at least you're dealing with the reality of the situation. I wanted to talk to you about your memo. Should we give you some input on that after the meeting, or
Input on this memo?
your memo? You have potential step 5 and 6. Seems like there are things missing and things that are going to change. Would you agree on this?
I think it is your process. This was
Okay.
just my
We're not doing this
recommendation
today,
of where
though?
to start. I think,
Okay,
I
I'll
think
just send you my thoughts and have everyone send their thoughts.
yeah, that'll be
Kevin, you
fine.
mean with respect to?
Or,
The next steps or the
various
way
points,
forward?
Points 1 through 9 on whatever page it is of the.
yeah, those are the things we're supposed to be talking to Fred about right now. I'm more talking about, she's also proposing a step 5, 6,
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
7, and I think there are things missing in
Okay.
those.
If we, your point is, if we have any thoughts about changing or reorganizing that set of steps,
Yeah.
we should let the staff know that
Yes.
if we wish to, and you're going to send some comments.
I'm not trying to change those steps, other information needed or factors to
Sure.
consider. I think that's what I meant.
Okay.
So change probably isn't the right word.
Okay.
Add to
Yes,
information needed
so-
to factors considered.
Well, we already
Exactly. So
know
my
point-
suggestion would be, is either recess this meeting to another date or close this meeting and open another one. But I would suggest we come back together for another work session and we start going through 4, 5, 6, we start going through, you start having a discussion about options, in terms of, what are viable, what are not viable options, what other information, let's make sure we got a good list of other information so I can make a plan to go get that for you. So that's what I would really propose you do next.
Well, point 5 is determine what other information council may need.
Right.
We already have given some input on that
Given me
today. We may
some.
have others, as Kevin's
Right.
pointing out, so that's, we'll
Yeah.
continue to do that. So the question is, how does the council want to proceed on this subject? And one option is to build it into the work sessions we have at our
Or-
second and fourth Tuesday meetings, or the second option would be to have a special meeting such as we've done today, solely working on this process.
The one's fine with me.
Our work sessions probably available sometime to do that on the second and fourth Tuesdays, coming up next week, for example, but I'm of an opinion that we probably are going to need another separate meeting, kind of like this. It gives us a little more framework and time to deal with, Jeff.
Particularly since we only have one meeting in
We only
November,
have one
December.
meeting in November
Yeah,
as well, so.
That's what I'm
all right.
thinking.
I haven't looked at the agenda, and we haven't talked about it for next week, and I think there's some things we need to do in that work session, but would there be, would the council want to take up
No,
next Tuesday?
I don't. I think that we've got a number of things that we have to get done before the end of the year. 160D, planning things. And this is important too, but it doesn't have the same kind of time urgency. We've got a limited amount of time. Our staff has been put through this year COVID, which was a big surprise, okay, and draining. The USGA, which was a big job, and then the Baldrige. And we've still got all of our regular background stuff to do, plus 160D, which we have to get done. We don't, I think that we can't just say, oh, we're going to pile this on top as well. And then we've got all our retreat work to do. I'd like to see this taken up when we have time to focus on it and give it the attention it needs, and also give other things that need to get done right now their attention, and not to put both council and staff under so much pressure that they can't do a good job on everything. I think that's important.
I would like to do more work before the retreat, so that we can have a more effective retreat.
I think we have to give Fred enough information to do his job. It's a bare minimum. We have to be able to do that. I agree with you mostly on taking the workload off staff, but aren't we given enough information for Fred to do his job?
I think we've done most of the heavy lifting already.
Yeah, so we're really
On this-
trying to
on
make
this
sure that we don't
particular
have Fred
project.
idle. Would you agree with that?
Well, I don't know what
Yep.
Fred is, I don't know what Fred is doing.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. We have to get enough done.
Right.
I'm saying we have to get enough done so he could finish what he started.
I mean, steps 5, 6, and 7 seem like,
Yeah.
you know, you need us to do that work before we get to the retreat. If that's not the case, tell us, but if you need another meeting, let's have it.
Have to get more done.
I think in order for our consultants to wrap up and provide the information that you need for the, I think we would be better served as an organization if we go into strategic planning with a handful of potential options that you may want to consider. I'm not saying have evaluated them, made a decision, made any decisions, but I think if we can go into December with, okay, here's the 3 or 4 options that, you know, might work, that we need to think about, it might give us a little bit more direction
Give us a better understanding of how it fits in the
of how
5-year
it fits
plan.
in the 5-year
Yeah.
plan, right?
But
Right.
if we save that discussion for our retreat, is that going to chew up time during the retreat? And maybe that time needs to be set aside before the retreat so we have a more clear understanding. I'm asking you because we've given you a long list of things that you and staff, you, Fred, whomever. So I'm just wondering if we need some update from you before the retreat, so the retreat doesn't get chewed up with library.
I think I
It's a-
might recommend deferring to the comment or suggestion that Natalie made previously, which was, we have in the past taken the opportunity to extend the retreat into the first week in January. And maybe just due to the, you know, the scope and scale of this thing, what we think about is this gets front-loaded into the agenda for the retreat in December, in early December, which means that we you know, some of the later actions and what we typically do in our retreat, we do in January. If we plan it that way, then we're not putting the staff in a bind to get there, along the lines of what Jane was referring to, but we can still facilitate moving this process forward.
Knowing this council, we could use more time in the retreat. Since I've been through one with this council already, we could probably use a little bit more time.
Well, each year you get better and better at it,
Yeah.
so we get a little bit more streamlined.
So I think that's a logical.
So what are we saying? Are we going to put
I,
up
I
the-
would agree with Jeff's suggestion. I mean, I think we would be better served to have the retreat the 10th and 11th. And if we need to continue retreat meetings into early January, then we just continue retreat meetings into early January. The only, I would say, hard deadline is for us to have our balanced scorecard goals adopted by the end of January, as well as our list of initiative action plans. Again, if this turns into a major initiative action plan, but we're not quite ready to call it one, right, in January, we can amend, modify, and place the placeholder, you know, and
We're just calling an IAP.
and just
but
call it
it's going to evolve over time. It's
just
fine, yeah.
do some iterative planning on it. So there's a number of ways to handle it.
Well,
I think we'll
then
be fine.
is the understanding of the council members then that, unless we change our minds, we won't have another specific discussion until we get to the retreat, and that the library just continues.
No,
Oh, I need for
I think we're open, from a staff perspective, we're open to having a work session or two, whether it's dedicated or it's during a scheduled work session, where we hit some of these touch points to make sure
Well,
we
that's
set
what I
up
was
the
Okay,
getting at,
good,
retreat.
yeah.
good.
That's
That's
what
what I
I'm getting
need
at.
to hear too. So right now, our action is to give you input on 5, 6, and 7.
that would be great if you.
yeah, why can't we do that via email now?
Or we can do that in your next work session as a group.
Do it ahead of time, and you bring
And then
To
bring
get-
it
yeah, get to you
consolidated.
ahead of
That's
time,
exactly
so
what
we're
I'm
more
thinking.
productive in our work session.
Yes.
So
We
that
give
means we
much.
need to get this input in the next few days, because our next work session is a week from tonight.
Yes.
Unless you want to schedule a separate
Unless we
work
want a
session.
separate, I wasn't hearing support for that idea.
I'm
Maybe I
fine with
didn't.
that. I mean, whatever works.
Shall we try to, let's
Yeah.
see what we can do at the
Next
next
week.
work session on
Okay.
Tuesday night
Yeah,
with the
and
subject, and
all-
if we have to have it carry on to yet another date, we'll do that, but. it
All
will
I'm
be
doing is
before.
adding to things on potential options and other information needed, so.
Perfect.
It's not like it's reinvention of the wheel here.
Yeah, I'm prepared and ready to, come back to discuss this with you whenever you are.
All right, so that will be.
Next Tuesday will be fine.
To some degree or another, there'll be time committed next Tuesday night at our work
Yep.
session to the subject.
Yes,
Okay.
sir.
All right, along with other things. All right, I think that takes us right where we wanted to be.
It is.
Everybody, any
Yes.
council have any other suggestions where we are today? All right. Hearing none, I will close this meeting. Thank everybody for your attention.
Thank
Oh,
you.
we have